Good morning. My name is Jason Smith, and I am one of the band directors here at Wahoo. We are very excited to put on the Week of Understanding here at Wahoo. And to all of the schools we're broadcasting out to, thank you for joining us. And thank you to our guests that are joining us here today. This is a really amazing educational opportunity. Holocaust education is something that all students should learn about. It has a huge, huge impact on history, and even choices and things that are happening today have been impacted by the things that happened at this time. Please make sure that we leave our cell phones away completely. And also, this is a bit of a somber and kind of serious topic, so please show this event the gravity and respect that it deserves. So now I'm going to hand the mic over to Scott Litke. He's the director of the Institute for Holocaust Education. Please welcome Scott Litke.
We're honored to be here today. Thank you to Wahoo High School and Middle School later, and to all of you who are able to see this online. Our Week of Understanding reaches thousands of people with the narrative, the stories, the personal survival of those who experienced the trauma of the Holocaust. When we started 16 years ago, we were able to have firsthand experience, people speak, people who physically went through the experience. Death camp of Auschwitz was liberated 81 years ago this past January. We're now at the point where our survivor population has aged out, and those who are still with us typically are not able to share their experiences. We are gifted now with having the children and grandchildren who share their experiences. They're called the second generation. Those are the parents, and then the grandchildren are the third generation. This morning you're going to hear Sid Gottlieb, who's here from Toledo, Ohio, and she is a 3G, the grandchild of survivors. And I know that you will find this experience very moving. So please help me in welcoming Sid.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Jason. And thank you all for taking the time to be with me today. So, listen, I'm old school. I have a printout, and I'm going to be using it. Yes, my name is Sid Gottlieb. And I'm a self-taught visual artist from Ohio, and I'm also the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. I'm going to share a bit with you all about who I am, my family history, and why I do things the way that I do. You know, why I make art, the reasons behind why I'm an artist. So as mentioned, I'm self-taught, which means I did not attend art school. I don't really have a formal education, and instead I figured it out, as I go. So, first a little bit about art. So typically I don't plan things out, and I embrace the idea of making with what's in front of you. Through the process of making, we can find the humanness in the handmade and materialize our thoughts and process what we want to bring into existence. And what sort of future do we want to see in the world? Personally, I want to live in a world where we can explore conversation together and build new relationships. So, refugee history exists on both sides of my family, and culturally there's a lot of trial and error involved, when trying to get to where you want to go. And so, I don't know, maybe you haven't met a Jewish person before, but there are some values. Yes, it's a religion, it's also an ethnicity, it's a culture. So I feel very cultural when I make, and it's a very Jewish characteristic to develop innovative responses to critical issues, and the core values of our culture emphasize collective responsibility, community, education, and a deep-rooted need to constantly question. And I want to emphasize that. So I feel most connected by making art and using my own visual language to question. So this all start? This is the kind of artwork that I made when I started to draw again, as an adult. It's very abstract, super detailed, tight line work, and very compressed. You know, I felt the need to get in as much as I could. And I used to over-explain. I used to be a total perfectionist. If a piece of paper had the tiniest smudge on it, I didn't want to use it. And anything that I wrote had to be grammatically perfect. Everything always felt like a life or death experience. And I was constantly worried and constantly stressed. So here you can see there's a lot of squiggling. And that's kind of how I went through adolescence, around your age. I always felt like, you know, getting something in at a deadline, you know, being somewhere exactly on time. I didn't want anyone to really be able to pin me down, you know. I felt like maybe someone was on my tail and I had to shake them off. So, in thinking about it, you know, maybe perhaps I was trying to lose myself. Maybe I was trying to shake myself off of my own tail. And over time, I began to realize that what I was creating was actually something else. So after living and working in Boston for more than a decade, you know, I went to school in Boston. I'm 37, so lived a lot of adult life. And I crash landed back in Ohio towards the end of 2018. I was stressed. I was fortunate enough to have gone to a good school, worked for a contemporary art museum, worked in academic publishing. I still wasn't making enough to keep up with the cost of living. And, you know, I was out on the East Coast, I was trying to make it. But, you know, after working on the business side of things, for and with artists, I realized that I wanted to be the artist. And I needed to reprioritize my life. So I made the conscious decision to move back to my hometown. And that crash landing was literally me moving into my mom's boyfriend's house for much longer than I wanted to. And, you know, I realized that I needed to face some fears and get in touch with my roots. I never thought I'd come back to Ohio. I never felt comfortable growing up where I did, and I was scared of coming back to this place that I had worked so hard to get out of. So I went back into restaurant work, I picked up a couple of jobs, and I was still feeling pretty uneasy. Why couldn't I put my finger on it? But I knew that I had to face some fears in order to figure it out. So that is when I started drawing again, like this. And, you know, as a kid, I always felt safe in the art room, and when things felt like they were trapping me, that's where I could really set myself free. So when the pandemic hit in 2020, I was absolutely exhausted. And right when the world shut down, I could finally rest, and the very next day, my body gave out. I needed emergency spinal surgery. I was stuck on the floor waiting for an MRI. I couldn't walk, crawl into the bathroom, all these things you don't think about until you can't stand up. And I was very close to being permanently paralyzed. But because I was so young, doctors weren't taking me seriously, and, you know, but I knew there was something going on inside. And my abstract style originally developed in tandem with my recovery from spinal surgery. I was tapping into psychological and bodily sensations, and as I started to draw more and more, I was able to track time, channel pain, and try to enliven a body that seemed to have failed me. So, along with other factors, I do truly believe that part of this collapse was due to a deep unrest fueled by stress, tension, and anxiety. And by following shape, line, form, color, and whatever materials were in front of me, I could process on the page, put everything into the artwork, walk away with my life, and then come back and kind of reflect. And after doing that enough, you know, some exercises for the self, I started to become more confident in social situations, talking to people, and having those conversations inside as well. So, why am I spending all this precious time talking about art? It's important to both my story and that of my grandparents, because there's this idea of wayfinding, of navigating through your own pathways and finding what blends and merges and what decisions to make in real time, in the moment, and being confident in that decision to go somewhere else, to change that color pattern, but then really land on that feeling of cohesion, to know when it's done. And when it's abstract, you know, that's all on you. You figure out when something feels right and when it feels complete. So, in 2021, during the digital days of the pandemic, I moved into my own little basement apartment. I was still recovering from spinal surgery. It was a very rough recovery, and I was literally building from the ground up. I was relearning how to walk. And yes, I do have metal in my back. I'm a robot. And, you know, during those times, it was pretty isolating. I was, you know, in this little basement, and my mom lived in the same town. I went back to my hometown, and she invited me to participate in an online meeting with her. And it was for 2Gs, second generation children of Holocaust survivors. And, you know, I wasn't really sure about it, but I wanted to try to connect with her and get back to my Midwestern roots and be there for her. And she was there for me during, you know, my recovery. So I said, okay, I'll try it, you know. And I was the only younger person in this meeting. It was a Zoom meeting full of children of Holocaust survivors. And they were very welcoming. They let me, you know, spend some time in there, and I sat and I absorbed and I listened. And everyone was kind of practicing telling about their family stories. And I knew that that was what I had always wanted to do. I didn't know what or how, but this story that was trying to get out of me from as long as I can remember, you know, I needed to find a way to do that. And so I'm thrilled to be here with you all today. So during this time, I was working at a vinyl record store. I started to teach expressive arts workshops for a mental health community center, and helping people to figure out what they maybe didn't yet know how to say. I began to loosen up. And, you know, as a kid, I always felt like maybe there was a target on my back. I didn't want anything, that perfectionism was, I didn't want anyone to attribute potential failings to my Jewishness, to my identity, being less than perfect, being something other. And so, you know, I took a speaking trainer course, and I learned how to say a little bit more. And that very same summer, neo-Nazis marched through my hometown. Oh, this is real, this is important. So, this trajectory, this is the visual language that I was trying to create, what I'm about to share with you all. What I was trying to express that now I thankfully do have the words for. So, growing up in Northwest Ohio, I was the only Jewish girl in my class in a secular school. And as mentioned, I felt this responsibility to represent my culture, and, you know, I always kind of felt protective of my mother, and I didn't really know why. And we always hung out with my dad's family, but not really my mom's. And, you know, you always want to get to know who your family is. And, you know, I was just wondering, what about mom's family? Like, where's her family? And, you know, people kind of ask, well, when did you know that your family went through the Holocaust? And to be honest, I don't remember not knowing. There was just kind of this feeling of there's something else there. And so maybe when I was around the age of 8 or so, I had some really nice bonding moments with my mom. We would go up to the guest bedroom of our house, and I knew what was coming, you know. It was a very precious, special time. We'd go up to this bedroom, and there'd be this closet, and on the very top shelf of this closet was a box. And she'd bring it down, and I'd sit there, just, And what I learned was my mom's family was in this box. So inside this box, there were primary authentic documents of different paper types, fonts, chronological stamps, languages, and very carefully she let me touch the papers. Be careful with your fingerprints. And in this box, I realized that my family had this entire journey between countries and concentration camps and ghettos and displaced persons camps. And it was all there in this map, choreography, maze-like visual of a story. By following patterns and details, I began to understand. And this method of discovery can apply to anyone who's found themselves in a nonlinear path. Just start drawing and see where it takes you. And I'll tell you about that nonlinear path with regard to my family story. And so before, I know, another preface to a preface, right? This is very important, though. I want to make a note about how generations later, most of us with survivor history are still uncovering bits of information and piecing together whatever parts of our family story we can find. Some people's family history, might be served right up on a platter, a nice family tree, and it's ready to go. But we in the survivor community have to piece it together ourselves as it comes. It's not open and shut. We're constantly mining, correcting, revising, working to share a story as accurately as possible. And it doesn't necessarily come together chronologically. Sometimes you think you know something, and then another detail comes to light, and when you think you know what that is, then, something else comes up. There's frustration in not knowing how to pronounce your own family's name, or town, or, where we come from. These identities are in these fragmented bits and translations. And so, while looking to honor our legacies, we also have to know that, there might be more to learn or discover, but we're doing the best that we can in the moment. And that's all that anyone can do. So some of these photos are out of order, but it all comes back around. And we dig as deeply as we can, and we say what we know. So from an early age, I recognized that my life existed because many people had died. This is my mom, and on the top left are her parents, Eva and Ed, and on the top right are her parents, Myra and Judith. You say, what? So, in this box, as I'm understanding who my family is, my mom has to also explain to me that there's a reason why she calls her parents, and why she calls her biological parents, Myra and Judith. So Myra and Judith, my biological grandparents, are right there. So I'm going to refer to him as Myra and my grandmother as Judith, because that's how I knew of them. So this is Myra Frischblatt, my mom's biological father, who was born in Warsaw, Poland, January 19th, 1909. He was the son of Shmuel Frischblatt, who was a craftsman. He owned a suitcase factory, and Sarah Lee Hochberg was his mother. Meyer's family was religiously observant, an Orthodox family, and from what I know, they lived very comfortably. So this photo is, I don't know if I can, so here's Meyer, you can see the cursor. And at this point in time, he was about 17, and this is the headstone unveiling of Meyer's maternal grandmother, Tova Devorah Hochberg, daughter of Zvi Ziv the Kohen of Shedlitz, which I believe was located south of Lodz in Poland. And Tova passed away in 1926. And in this photo, Meyer's probably about to go into business school. And every single person in this photo, aside from Meyer, was murdered. So Meyer did have a wife. I don't know her name, but I believe her last name, her maiden name, was Kubashevik. And they married in the nearby Polish town of Białystok in February of 1932. In 1933, Meyer's first daughter, Sarah, was born. She's not sure how old here, but I guess maybe 5 or so. So here is some money, but much of this money doesn't formally exist anymore, though we see that it did exist at some point in time. Between World War I and World War II, borders and nationalities continued to change as territories and empires fluctuated, and much of my family was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Those places then became Russian. Also in the middle of changing borders meant that many languages were spoken and heard, which I believe contributed to Meyer's ability to pick up on languages. In the Eastern European area known as Galicia, languages were very fluid. So Meyer's family owned a suitcase manufacturing family, and on August 23rd of 1939, there was a pact called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which formally divided Poland. So on this fun little clip art at the bottom corner, you can see that one side became German Nazi territory and the other side became Soviet territory. So Warsaw is here, and Białystok, where Meyer got married, is here. So let's see here. About 1 week later after this pact was established, the Germans invaded Poland, September 1st, 1939. And this marked what many say is the official beginning of World War II. However, the first concentration camp, Dachau, was established in 1933. So a lot of things had to happen to get to this point. And I'm unsure if, if Meyer worked elsewhere, but he would go off on business in between these different areas. And in 1939, the family factory was ordered to close. Jewish businesses were seized, and the government took away any way for Jewish families to earn money. So Meyer could no longer work. And at that point in time, Meyer and his wife and his daughter, they all knew something was coming. So they were forced to move out of their homes into the Warsaw Ghetto. Jews were made to wear stars on their clothing called Magen David, the Stars of David. They were yellow patches, identifiers of Judaism. And once men were ordered to start wearing those stars, in an effort to escape tensions in Warsaw, the family decided that it was time for Meyer to leave. So, right around that time, when those orders came, men were being, targeted. So in November of 1939, only a few months after things shifted, the family agreed Meyer would go to the northeastern countryside, out to Białystok, so across that border, and stay with family friends, the Rubensteins. Originally, they thought this was going to be 5-6 months, wait for things to blow over. But persecution extended to other areas. And this larger map up in the center is the Warsaw area. And then this picture up on the corner is the wall of the Warsaw Ghetto. And so Jews from all of these different places in this center map were more or less huddled into the ghetto. There were other ghettos. You can see there are other towns up there, Lodz and Szedlitz. But in those center towns, and then that highlighted name right up there, Treblinka, is where many people went after. And Treblinka was a death camp. So, about 6 months after Meyer left Warsaw, it was determined that anyone coming from German-occupied parts of Poland who were living in the eastern part of Soviet-controlled Poland were ordered to take Russian citizenship. I never met my grandfather, but I believe as though Meyer knew. He knew so much more than what he could write down. And I felt as though I knew Meyer from his first-hand testimonies, which I'm so lucky to have. This geographical gathering of language, this was a skill set, this was a lifeline. Keep this in mind for later. So here's Meyer writing. I have plenty of beautiful notes from him and some audio tapes, and his accent is thick. This was a person who needed the whole world to know what happened to him. So I'm going to share a story from one of his tapes. In 1940, the Russians knocked on doors to force anybody from German-occupied cities to take Russian citizenship. Meyer refused and proclaimed that he was not a communist. On June 15, 1940, at the age of 31 years old, he was arrested, taken alongside political prisoners, thieves, bandits, and what he called hooligans. And he was loaded onto a train. There were 70 cattle cars, eventually destined for a slave labor camp for single men, located 6,000 miles deep into Russia. Each car stuck 32 people into a space where there was no room to lay down. There was one hole in the floor for bathroom needs, and each car was given 1 pail of water a day, plus maybe some fish or half a slice of bread. When people could no longer withstand poor conditions and passed away, their dead bodies were thrown from the trains, as there was no time to stop on their journey. The entire trip lasted 4 weeks. In June of 1941, Nazi Germany conducted Operation Barbarossa and invaded the Soviet Union. So after some time in limbo, I believe Meyer was in a church where political dissenters were being temporarily held. The Russians moved Meyer and other people out to labor camps. In 1941, Meyer began a 5-year sentence of hard labor without trial or ever seeing a judge. Essentially, he was kidnapped. When Meyer was arrested with political dissenters, the Russian Commandant military police stripped and searched all of their intended incoming prisoners, and everyone's belongings were taken away. In the process of all of this, Meyer took a pocket watch and hid it in a sock, and kept that sock in his shoe. The soldiers didn't notice. So after a couple of months of existing on thin oatmeal and water, he got very hungry. There was no coffee, no tea, and he was hungry, and he learned that somebody, somewhere nearby had bread. So he decided to sell his watch. Meyer went to the person who was working as a barber, where the Russian soldiers went to get their haircuts. And Meyer asked, "Can you find out who wants to buy a watch?" A couple of weeks later, the door opened, a soldier entered the barracks and mentioned Meyer's name. The soldier approached his bed and said, "You, Frischblatt, take your belongings and come with me." So he took Meyer to the commandant quarters at 7 o'clock in the evening, and he said, "Listen, you had a watch. Give me the watch." In this moment, Meyer says nothing, and he takes his bag, turns it over, emptying out all the items that he has, his shirt, his shoes, and out comes the watch. The commander took it away and ordered him back to the barracks. At the time, the Russians did not exterminate prisoners, but inmates were tortured and worked until they died. After some more months went on, Meyer's weight was maybe 80 to 90 pounds, and he was still sick, tired, and very hungry. While out in the workyard, he saw soldiers standing with a gun, watching him, all of them. So, Meyer was desperate. He was so desperate, he walked up to the soldier, opened up his button-down shirt, and said, "Shoot me. I cannot work. Cannot do it anymore. Shoot me." And the soldier said, "Oh no, we need you to work." Through primitive work, every day people were dying, but they would not shoot him, and he was so desperate. As it turns out, Meyer actually kept other things in his shoe. For his entire 5-year sentence in the Soviet camp, which, remember, he earned just for being Jewish, without ever seeing a judge or having a trial, we believe that he kept a photo of his 6-year-old daughter. I would say she'd be about 6 or 7 by the time this would have happened. So this is Sarah. He kept that picture in his boot. And we still have these pictures today. And that photo on the left, I imagine, was crumpled up in his boot. Meyer later learned that she likely died in the pits of Treblinka, that concentration camp north of Warsaw. But we believe that his love for her and the hope that she was still alive kept him going. And I think of her often. You know, again, many people had to die for me to be here. And that's a heavy burden for a child. In 1946, Meyer received his right to return to Poland. And there was this neighborhood called Praga in Warsaw. So he traveled to Praga, where many Jews lived, and it seemed as though most of the Polish Jewish community went to look for lost relatives. Meyer was informed in an evidence office that his wife and daughter, along with about 95% of his family, 70 to 80 people, were taken to Treblinka and murdered because they were Jewish. So here's my grandmother, Judith Cohn. She was also looking for family after the war. And this is where Meyer and Judith met. Her story is very interesting. Born on June 20th, 1918, from Zotov, a shtetl, which is like a very small kind of neighborhood, not as developed as a city maybe. So she was from this village outside of what is now Lviv, Ukraine. And at the time, Lviv was a part of Poland, and it was called Lemberg. So this also gets, kind of complicated when people say, "Where are you from?" And then the borders change, the town names change. It's very hard to prove your point sometimes. So while Meyer goes east from Nazi territory into Soviet territory, Judith flees Soviet territory and moves west towards Nazi territory. And I don't know how she knew when to leave, but she, I believe, got out just in time. It was very common in those small towns that there would be mass murders of Jews. So Judith assumed false papers. She got a forged identity as a Russian Catholic girl. And remember, in this area, you usually know how to speak multiple languages. So within the home, people spoke Yiddish, which is a Jewish language that combines different kinds of languages together. And she probably spoke Polish, Russian, and German. So she was able to speak Russian and pose as a Russian Catholic girl, and she found work in the kitchen of a convent. When she was sleeping one night, she was mumbling Yiddish. And I don't think a good Catholic Russian girl knows Yiddish. So the nuns kicked her out. They threw her out of the convent, and she was a young woman out on her own. You know, during this time, she was probably not much older than 22, 23, 24. And she was sleeping between tombstones in a cemetery for who knows how long, going out at night looking for food. One night, a woman, caught her, saw this person running around at night, sleeping between the tombstones. She called the Germans to take Judith away. However, due to a false identity, Judith goes to Bergen-Belsen, which was considered an elite concentration camp. Rather than an extermination camp, it was hard labor. Forced labor because she posed as a Russian Catholic girl rather than being sent to an extermination camp for being a Jewish girl. People with good passports, quote unquote, were sent to Bergen-Belsen. And because there are gaps in Judith's story, I don't fully know how long she was there, but somewhere between ages 25 and 28. Judith was liberated by the British in 1945, and these camps were originally set up to accommodate about 8,000 people, but by the time of liberation, there were 40,000 people there. The Nazis tried to hide the evidence of poor sanitation, and they were overfilled. They were well over capacity. So in this scramble to try to liquidate these camps before liberation, a lot of people were shot, and there were death marches where people had to go out and kind of flee their locations, and many people passed away on these marches. Apparently the British buried about 30,000 people just from Bergen-Belsen. And Judith was very sick. Many people after liberation, they weren't able to even eat what we would consider normal food. Their stomachs could not handle it. So how do you rehabilitate somebody who's so malnourished and maybe full of lice and whatever else? So she had typhus fever and was sent to Sweden to recover. And it is believed that she possessed her forged papers, she possessed her forged identity the entire time. There was no record of her actual name at this hospital, and Jewish authority groups wanted to help her, but there was no proof of who she was, and she never broke character. She kept to her alias the entire time. People at the hospital in Sweden were wondering, who are you? Who's this girl? She wasn't even yet 30. And that proves how scared she was to be out and open and Jewish. And that's what I kind of felt in Ohio, too. So, here are some documents. Meyer and Judith met in Warsaw while looking for family. They both learned that there was nobody nearby, so they banded together and they married in 1946. Judith had one brother who survived, moved to Israel. My mom met his son, her cousin, once in the United States. So Judith and Meyer decided life was too hard running from country to country, and Europe was very anti-Semitic, so they decided they needed a rest. They decided to go into displaced persons camps. And so here is that letter about Judith, where they needed proof of who she was. And on these letters here, basically they were saying that she could not get restitution because she was not persecuted as a Jew, but she needed to explain how her life was in danger to be a Jewish person. And it's just, after everything that you go through, how stressful, right? To not even be believed. So here are those documents to try to be believed. You had to more or less state who you were. Let's see. So this is, so Meyer, he was able to actually get a job through the United States Army in his displaced persons camps through the United Nations because of his ability for language. So they check themselves in, and then over here you have their displaced persons card numbers. Judith was DP identity 600982 and Meyer was 600826. And so Meyer was able to go work as an administrative assistant in the US zone of this area in Germany, this camp, Stadt-Ohm. And they went through about 3 different displaced person camps. And Meyer was able to move Judith with him every single time. So they stuck together, it became a lifeline. And here we have some more just authentic documents. Here's a ration card, because in all of these refugee camps, they had limited supplies. And I believe it was Meyer's job to also go through and check those supplies and to, translate and negotiate with the imports and exports at the camp. This is Meyer's UN Displaced Persons Card, identity card. And here is a testimony, because they had no identification coming out of, a Russian slave labor camp, a German slave labor camp. Everything was gone. Who are you? No ID, no nothing. So here they have some testimonies, I was born this day, my parents were these people, and then they had witnesses of, I went to so-and-so's birthday party, or, I knew them before the war. And what's very interesting is the same people made the same testimonies on Meyer and Judith's cards. It's a coincidence? Maybe. They were from relatively the same area in Poland, but not that close. They weren't that closely, nearby. And that's just kind of the reality that everyone lived in, is you had to trust people at their word of, I am who I say I am, and if you met some people afterwards, once you were out looking for family, and maybe they knew your family, maybe they were at that birthday party. I don't know. But it is something that I absorbed as a kid. When you're writing essays and you have to cite your sources, I was just, I was always so paranoid that someone would think I wasn't telling the truth. Sometimes you also have to do what you can do to get by. That forged paper of a Russian identity. Sometimes you have to make choices. So these are identity cards, in and out kind of cards of registration into different displaced persons camps. The top darker colored paper is a medical record for Judith. She had a miscarriage while in a displaced persons camp. And that was likely because she was so malnourished. And they were in DP camps from 1946 to 1951. Because of Meyer's status working with the UN, he became a secretarial interpreter. You know, they were trying to get out. They were trying to go to the United States. They got a ticket to go on a ship to Australia that was rerouted. And then he finally got approval to go to the United States. So, again, he could take Judith with him, another lifeline. And there was this organization called HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which helped Jews who survived camps to be placed in cities in the United States that it was determined they had enough resources to care for people, social services, jobs, housing. There were ways for people to kind of get back on their feet, and it was through the Jewish community. And today, HIAS is not just for Jews, it's for cultural refugees anywhere from any religion, and they operate in specific countries. But they started because of Jewish persecution, and during World War II, it was another lifeline. This is more of Meyer's work papers, a supply officer, and an interpreter. And here they are in the United States. And, you know, Meyer was in heaven. He had a car. He had air conditioning. This was living. But, you know, it was hard. Mental, physical, emotional health. How do you integrate into an already well-balanced society, you know? So, my livelihood in the United States exists because of HIAS and also Jewish Family Services. In 1951, Meyer and Judith were resettled in Toledo, Ohio by this refugee organization, and my mom, Bev, was born in 1952. It was determined that Toledo had these resources, and, you know, after all that they had been through, you know, we don't really think about this, but of course there were people who couldn't care for their children. There were physical, psychological traumas, poor living conditions, lack of opportunities, language barriers, you know, like any immigrant, right? Or any immigrant fleeing from somewhere for, you know, political asylum or refugee kind of needs. So about 6 months after my mom was born, Judith developed Parkinson's disease and became very sick. As you can see here in her naturalization paper, she had a very deadpan face, which is, you know, pretty different from here. She has a nice little smile. And here, you know, she has some smiles. And so she was unable to care for a child. At the time, Jewish Family Services had a foster and adoption program. So my mom lived with 2 different families before she came to live with her parents and found her family. At the time, Eva Rosenberg, remember Eva and Ed, my mom's parents, they were volunteering, Eva was volunteering, to help resettle refugees. And she was in charge of placements for children. When she saw my mom's picture, she decided, I want that little girl. Eva and Ed Rosenberg were born in the 1800s. They were college educated, wealthy in their older age, Jewish, never having kids of their own. They took in my mom when she was 26 months and they were in their 50s. From the first time that my mom ever visited them, she remembers a large crystal chandelier that seemed to have transported her back, you know, into a different world. It was so bright and so beautiful. The TV there was color. However, seeing as how Meyer and Judith were not willing to give up their only family member, the 4 parented my mom together. They had a permanent foster arrangement. Ed, in this top right picture here, he was co-founder of B&R Manufacturing, an inventor, an engineer. He was brilliant. His name was also Adolf. but they changed that. He could not live with being named Adolf after Hitler and those atrocities. So Ed gave Judith a job in his factory when no one else would hire her because of her physical and psychological illnesses. Eva was a school teacher, and she taught Meyer, Judith, and other refugees English in a high school program at night. It was a real community effort. My mom did spend time with Meyer. He lived in an inner city duplex, top floor. The apartment was furnished by donations. He had a black and white TV. And my mom remembers Meyer's homemade chicken noodle soup, homemade noodles. She can envision his colander. They shared Tuesday night dinners together. But my mom lived full-time at the Rosenbergs. But Meyer still needed his child. Every day at 6 p.m., my mom had to talk on the phone with him, and she hated it. He seemed so stern and angry. It was a forced relationship. She wanted to be American. When he would come over to the Rosenbergs' house, my mom would run away, run out of the room, and not even look at him. And Eva would be so angry, saying, "You're so rude. You don't even know what he's been through." And she didn't. She did not understand. All she knew was that he wouldn't let her go to fully be with her parents, and she didn't want to be taken away from her parents. But can you imagine having already lost a wife and a daughter to now have your second wife sick and also not able to have your daughter? Meyer did acclimate well, despite his limited employment options. He knew about 7 languages, but he worked in a hamburger shop. So in his spare time, he decided to try to make a Yiddish dictionary and write his own, language. And that's what these scraps of paper are here. But, Meyer attended my mom's birthday parties and family events, and they all got together. They eventually connected a bit better, but why did my mom only spend time with Meyer? Why not Judith? Judith was suffering. And remember, my mom lived with the Rosenbergs, so she did not stay overnight with Meyer and Judith. It's possible that she had some delusions, some serious mental health issues from going through the camps. It's also possible maybe she had some mental health problems before the war, but trauma usually will bring out issues even further. And so I have to be honest with you all. One night, she doused herself in gasoline and took her own life, lit herself on fire, and we think she could not handle the grief of surviving when her family also likely went by fire. So, in wanting to go the way that her family did, that's what we think. And Meyer was home, and Judith went to the hospital, but she did not survive. And my mother went to Judith's funeral. She was 9. So now Meyer loses a second wife. And thankfully, they began to establish a little bit better of a relationship. And I think my mom started to grow to understand loss and her family's loss. So eventually my mom did connect and help Meyer to prepare for a radio interview. English was Meyer's 7th or 8th language, least proficient, and she was coaching him. Around 1976, there was this docudrama called Holocaust with big movie stars, and this is a good 30 years after people started to open up a little bit about what happened in the war. So people came knocking. They wanted to hear from a survivor. And in the same way that Judith would not reveal her real name, Meyer had to protect himself, and he decided that he was going to use a false name for the radio interview. So he was called Martin Fisher, and he wanted to tell everybody about his story. So, you know, they were asking him, what about this Hollywood blockbuster movie? And he's just trying to tell everybody, you know, this is what happened, and this is in the government, and, you know. And I have this really beautiful 7-minute, you know, 8-minute clip, but I wanted to play for you what he says, and so that you can hear his voice, you can hear his pain and also his eagerness to try to communicate in English and try to explain how he felt. They also asked why he thinks he survived. And his, you know, that same thing of telling the guard to shoot him. You know, he says, accidents, miracles. That's how he survived.
I can't figure out what this was.
The Nazis killed his family. The Russians nearly killed him. And because of their present policy toward the Jewish people, Martin Fisher is as bitter toward the Russians as he is toward the Nazis.
The Nazis is bandits, and the Russians is not better. You go in the same way now, but Hitler is still over there in Russia, is one-party system, and they don't let out the Jewish people. The Russians kill you in a cold war, and the Germans kill you in a hot war.
Mr. Fisher calls the Russia of today our modern Holocaust, and the weight of evidence is growing on his side. Columnist William Sapphire recently reported that the CIA has photographed and documented the presence of huge slave labor camps throughout the Soviet Union. For WCWA News, I'm Jean Perry.
So, to re-emphasize, Meyer saw Russians and Nazis as similar but different. Russians killed you by heat, which is how Judith also went. Russians killed you by the cold. And in this interview, you know, he talks about how 95% of his family went by heat in Treblinka. And he says, what can you do but cry? You just cry. But my mom did not just cry. She lived. She had a full life. She went to college, she got married, she raised kids. She wanted kids more than anything else. My brother Eli and I are here. And she ended up becoming president of the very same local agency that helped to resettle Meyer and Judith when they came to resettle Soviet refugees in the 1990s. So my mom helped them find housing and helped them find furniture and find jobs and everything else. And then I lived. I went to Boston University, and somehow knowing that an increased number of Latin Americans were seeking asylum and political refuge, I chose to study Spanish. I graduated with a bachelor's degree in Hispanic language and literatures. I've worked on publications, multilingual, just like Meyer, translating, editing, and knowing how language is a lifeline, how it gets you through, how it helped my family, and how it can help other people. And then I decided I was going to be an artist. And I created my own visual language. More language, more expression. And my final semester in undergraduate, I was able to take a graduate elective course called Literature of Memory. If you've ever read the book Night, or you know about Elie Wiesel, you'll know that he was one of the first to really share his story in detail. And Elie Wiesel was also my professor. Unbeknownst to all of us, I took, it was his final class when I took it, his final semester of instruction. So as his goodbye, he decided to review his own history and teach his own books. He showed us his number from Auschwitz, the concentration camp, tattooed on his arm. And we were all required to take a one-on-one meeting with him in his office. And I remember entering into his dark wooden study and sitting at this small table with him right by a window. And I just cried. What could I do but cry? Just absolutely bawling, because I had never knowingly sat in conversation with a survivor. I never knew Meyer, I never knew Judith. They died before I was born. And I'm sure I had talked to a survivor, but I didn't know I had talked to a survivor until this moment. And, up until that point, I sensationalized my grandparents' survivor experience, perhaps tokenizing, and kind of thinking of my mom and my grandparents in a way that helped me to dissociate from this inherent kind of inherited pain that became mine. And Professor Wiesel encouraged me to speak up more in class. That's also what I'm doing here today. What he taught me was you should not place yourself in a space where you're speaking for someone else. But you can envision being in their shoes and offer a window through which to share your story. Build your own voice, but don't speak for them. Do not speak for the dead. You don't know their experiences. You don't know why they chose what they did, when they had to go this way or that way, or, these squiggles, right? You can only speak to your understanding of how you interpret their experience. And so we sit in the unknown. And with abstract art, we create until we feel as though we know. So I became a teaching artist. I taught at a mental health center. I went on an artist residency. I have spoken at a museum, some live painting. I use my visual work as a teaching tool, and I bring ideas into community spaces, helping others to find their language and their expressive personalities, visual identity. I've also partnered with children going through the juvenile justice system. They're learning how to come out of incarceration. Refugees in my family had to learn how to live after being in these camps. There are so many parallels between what happened then and how people live now. Even if, it's not an extreme situation, there are still ways we move through the world that need a little bit of extra help, extra understanding. So, health issues, right? My spine, pain, all these complexities, and all these different people, when they all come together, these organizations, these resources, we can make it through. So, here's a little bit of my work that's more recent. And in this kind of body of work, I'm showing how factual narrative can intertwine with creative output and expression. So I have some graves here. A mass grave, gravel, dirt. This is a family portrait. And it's also delivering historical context. A lot of my work addresses starting over. I actually lost everything I owned. I had an apartment fire right after I graduated college. And I had no identity. I had no proof of my very expensive education, or, all I had was inside of me. And that's what my family always emphasized. You have your education, you have how you treat people, you have how you choose to move forward in the world. And no one can take that away from you. And I do carry forward the spirit of resilience. A lot of my work kind of questions boundaries, limits, what you choose to take, what you can withstand, whether material, external, a part of the self. When I'm running out of that burning building, I'm thinking just to live. This piece is kind of that haze in my mind where it's just like, get out, you have so much more to do, you have so much more to live. And my mother always told me, your job is to live, especially because other people couldn't. And maybe they didn't have the choices or the opportunities that you do have in order to live fully. So now I combine my work with living in the Midwest with my grandparents' resettlement experience as refugees in the Midwest. So I do bring in a lot of Jewish elements that you might not know unless I explain, but I'm making houses. I'm making a home. I had to leave my home. They had to leave their home. Is the Midwest home? Do you feel at home? Home is also what you make it. What I want to leave you all with is do not let your fear of becoming vulnerable stop you from using your vulnerability as a strength. And what I hope to move forward with is just this value of human life. Whether or not someone's a part of your immediate community, your religion, your race. In my eyes, my family's Holocaust legacy is to help rehabilitate humanity and rehabilitate the conditions that led to people being murdered in the way that my family was. You have to learn to humanize yourself after being told otherwise. And then you can help to reinforce humanity for others. And maybe it's an extreme, situation that you've been through, or maybe it's just feeling as though, you should be kinder to yourself. And if you find peace with yourself, you can find peace with others. And, so I'm glad to share about my heritage, and by combining my art practice with Holocaust education, I hope to highlight progress, generational progress, and stimulate dialogue, and, strategize, yes, but do not modify who you know yourself to be inside because of fear. So, thank you for your time today, and I'm here to continue conversation.
I would now invite individuals, we just have a little bit of time, people that have questions and would like to come on up and approach the microphone, and we'll have just a moment for questions. And I'd like to kick off with one question. Different variations of people that have been through traumatic experiences. My father was a Vietnam veteran and never spoke about his experiences in Vietnam until late in his life. It appears that your grandfather, through his writings and through his speaking, was maybe a little bit more open throughout speaking about his experiences. Was that your observation through his actions and doing the radio interviews and things like that?
System, okay. So from what I hear, yes. I did not know him personally, but he seemed to want people to know his story, but he was very careful about how to do that and who to trust with that information. I believe that he wanted some of these papers to go to historical Holocaust museums. I will say, I am the keeper, and I have these papers. And what someone has asked me before is, how did you get all of this documentation? And what I assume, again, I don't know, but because he was working in the office at the DP camp, he had access to his own files. And so what I assume is that once he knew they were emptying out this refugee camp and he could leave, he needed to bring proof with him. And he needed to show people in the United States, he needed to show all of this very legitimate, real documentation of his journey. So, you know, although we weren't able to find, you know, where these papers should go when he was alive, it's something that we're working on now. And by giving these presentations, I'm also able to show people with the images. So I think this is doing what he wanted. Judith, from what my mom told me, she did not talk. She sang, but she was very quiet, almost mute. And I mean, you know, given suicide and everything, that she was very inhibited.
Any questions?
In my personal time, I'm reading a book called Code Talkers about Navajos that were used about Navajos that were used to send messages for the United States. You said your grandfather was there. My worked in the DP for this, and sort of helping out with that. Did he ever experience stuff like that, where he had to deliver messages to higher authorities?
That's a great question. I don't know that. What I do know is he was able to communicate with people who also lived through traumatic experiences. So he was able to be that interpreter and that translator between other people in these displaced persons camps, because he was also living there as a displaced person. He just happened to have a job that had a little bit of leverage in that way. But, you know, so if you imagine if the United States was in charge of that one displaced persons camp, or if it was, you know, in Munich, maybe they spoke German, but they probably didn't speak Yiddish. They probably didn't speak, you know, certain kinds of Russian, Polish, etc. So he was able to probably glean more than what I imagine is communicated in some way. But I do like to think about that perhaps, you know, that's also what helped him survive in the labor camp. And that's what a lot of people said in concentration camps too, is this knowledge of language. You were able to broaden your community and look out for each other in different ways, negotiate, trade, things like that.
Any other questions?
Where did your great-grandfather live?
So my grandfather, Meyer, he was from Warsaw, Poland. And I believe that his father, my great-grandfather, was from a nearby town, Siedlica. I don't know anything about my family past my great-grandparents. I do know that my family has always been in the Jewish community, fully Jewish, and on both sides, you know, in these Eastern Europe kind of situations, European towns.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's give thanks to our speaker one last time. We will ask that the folks in the back, let's dismiss first, and then what period are we going to? Fourth period.
has
It was
a
fun.
brand new,
Yeah.
brand new
I kind of
container. Okay.
just tripped up over certain things of like, did I say this? Should I say that? You know. But that's fine.
There's a lot of really good stuff. I learned a lot of stuff. Yeah.
Oh yeah, of course. Here you go.
You have the,
It's in there.
oh, you
Very good.
Is that plugged in from my battery?
Yeah, let me get an extension cord going here for you.
Almost make it.
I think I like it.
Yeah. 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 Clunky. Yeah.
Which I know what you're getting at, and the only strikes me is like, when you get to the end,
Yeah.
it's really, really important.
Yeah.
So you guys, that would be the only thing that I would.
I didn't mean to go on as much as I did. I think I was found my way. Yeah.
Here's okay with you. I mentioned, my uncle fought in the Korean War, and he never talked about it. And so I'm going to say this, in the presentation earlier this morning, you mentioned that he was wartime. Dad fought in the Vietnam War, and I said, okay, if I do that, all right, let me bring it back to,
I know. I was like really struggling to figure out.
I'm just trying to connect with them, right? And they know you.
Say
Absolutely.
today.
And I always knew that my dad served.
The first time.
How old is he?
I'm like, why does this have to be out recorded?
Really, like 72, I'd say. About me, 72.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
So early 70s is when he finally kind of.
Yeah, I mean,
I was
that's
in my
something that,
early 30s.
I mean, I know he touched his mom, but
He was
Introduce yourself. Who are you? Where do you live today?
then, with like anyone who, you know, is
I can absolutely.
Something you're on where it's low.
But maybe, like, but there's also, it's not good.
Oh, yeah, I'll bring it. Actually, I'm going to turn it off a little bit.
I mean, I don't explicitly say that, which I probably should. I think in my head, everyone gets that point, but maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, again, are we set?
Yeah,
Yeah, so there's this issue that best choice also at the Mexican restaurant. Okay, good.
They go so fast, though.
It's only
I'm just going to address them real quick.
Yeah, yeah.
We keep our stuff.
Are we okay to leave our stuff here?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So I can leave my computer there?
Yes.
Okay.
100%.
Is there a clock in here?
There is not.
Okay.
I just put my phone on the podium. I was like, uh-oh.
But I think what I don't want to see happen